The Christian Crusaders who marched across Europe had one mission: kick out the Muslims who controlled the Holy Land and reclaim sacred Christian sites. But as they made their way east, they found another target, one they'd been living next to for centuries. The Jews of Europe had long refused to, quote-unquote, see the light. Fired up on holy zeal, the Crusaders gave them a brutal ultimatum: convert to Christianity or be burned alive in your synagogues. Most chose the second option. So when the Crusaders finally made it to the Promised Land in the summer of 1099, they probably didn't expect much resistance from the region's powerless Jewish communities. They were in for a nasty surprise. These Jews shared a common enemy with their Muslim neighbors. When the Crusaders came knocking, they were ready to fight. So did medieval Jews and Muslims really join forces to defend the Holy Land against Crusader armies? To understand what compelled so many European Christians to join the Crusades, you have to know two things. One, when it came to religion, medieval folks had zero chill. And two, for most of human history, might made right. If you wanted something, you had to be prepared to take it by force. And medieval Christians very much wanted the Holy Land. The Holy Land is sacred to all three Abrahamic faiths. Jesus had preached in the hills of the Galilee. He was baptized in the placid waters of the River Jordan. And he had staggered under the weight of the cross in the cobblestone streets of Jerusalem. The land was dotted with Christian holy sites, beckoning pilgrims from all over the world. But it had been in Muslim hands since the 600s, and that meant that non-Muslims were at the mercy of the various Muslim dynasties at each other's throats for regional control. Sometimes, Muslim leaders were more or less chill. Other times, they did things like destroy Jewish and Christian holy sites, including the most famous church in Jerusalem. Somehow, these atrocities spurred a wave of anti-Semitism in Europe, as local Christians blamed the Jews for the caliph's actions, even though he'd also targeted Jewish holy sites. Across Germany and France, Jews were massacred, expelled, and forcibly converted. So when the Pope called for a crusade to conquer the Holy Land from the Muslims, local Jews grew incredibly wary. Some communities even started fundraising in order to bribe the Crusaders to leave them alone. Sure, the Crusaders' real enemy was the Muslims, or as the Pope called them, a despised and base race which worships demons.
Tell me he didn't just say that.
But Christian religious fervor had reached a fever pitch, and no one was particularly interested in the theological differences between Muslims and Jews. An infidel was an infidel. If Christian pilgrims were being targeted, non-Christians would pay, especially the ones that Christians believed had crucified their God. Jews, after all, were said to have condemned Jesus. 11 centuries later, they still had to be punished. And they were. Across Europe and into the Holy Land, Jewish and Muslim communities found themselves at the mercy of men who believed they were fighting for heaven. The word crusade means those signed by the cross, which is a fancy way of saying Christian holy warriors, because the campaign to retake the Holy Land was nothing short of a holy war, a way to serve God, save Christian pilgrims, and secure a sweet spot in the afterlife. The fact that most Europeans had no ancestral link to the Holy Land didn't matter. Stories of the land figured prominently in Christian theology. To these Crusaders, Jerusalem was the heart of the universe, and they were ready to reclaim that cosmic hub from the Muslims who had held it for 400 years. Plus, it was obvious to everyone that some number of the Crusaders who set out from Europe would never return. Traveling was dangerous. Conquest, even more. Anyone who took up the cross automatically had their sins forgiven. And when you truly believe in the fires of hell, a guaranteed ticket to heaven is worth more than your life on earth. But people have always been people. And that means that coupled with these high-minded religious motives were other darker reasons to trudge across continents before trains, planes, or automobiles existed, like looting and pillaging.
Was that because of us? I don't know, I mean, it started off super positive, then it just got crazy.
Now, to be fair, crusading was expensive. It's not like the church was sponsoring a tour bus and snacks. Wealthy nobles could just barely afford to travel in style without worrying about wasting away from hunger en route to Jerusalem. Peasants? Not at all. Because Crusaders weren't all knights and lords and barons with chainmail and armies and pointy little lances. Roughly 150,000 people took up the cross, a motley crew of nobles and peasants, soldiers and clergy, men and women, the young and the old. There was no single Crusader army, no one leader. It was more or less a collection of mini militias with their own commanders, each doing their own thing. Of course, not everyone who took the cross actually made it to the Holy Land. there was plenty of holy warring to do in Europe itself. Now, we should be super clear about something. Pope Urban II said nothing explicit about Jews when he called for a crusade, and he'd reminded his audience that looting and pillaging were strictly off limits. But all his talk about routing the enemies of the Lord immediately stirred up anti-Jewish resentment. Not that 11th century European Christians needed much encouragement to hate their Jewish neighbors. The bustling Jewish communities along the Rhine were technically under the protection of both the crown and the church. But it's not easy to subdue a mob, and this one was out for converts, treasure, or revenge. If the Jews could be made to accept Jesus, they'd be spared, and a crusader could feel good about bringing the one true faith to one more stubborn soul. If they insisted on remaining Jews, well, they'd be put to the sword. Either way, their property would be theirs for the plundering. It was a win-win for the Crusaders and a lose-lose for the Jews. The Crusaders who sacked the Jewish communities of Mainz, Worms, and Speyer probably did not expect that many Jews would choose a third option. Predictably, they refused to convert to Christianity, but many also refused to fall to the Crusaders' swords. Entire families martyred themselves and their children, depriving the Crusaders of the satisfaction of taking their lives. It was a shocking act of defiance from an otherwise defenseless community, and the surprises kept piling up. It took 3 miserable years for the Crusaders to reach Jerusalem. They'd shivered and starved and succumbed to disease. Some had been reduced to eating their own horses. Others resorted to cannibalism. Even the most faithful were beginning to doubt that they'd ever reach Jerusalem. Recapturing the city for Christianity began to seem like a pipe dream. It was nice in theory when you thought about it in the comfort of your warm bed in Germany or France. It was a lot more daunting when you were freezing your face off outside the walls of Antioch as the Muslim army inched ever closer. And yet, somehow, the Crusaders managed to fight their way through. In the sweltering summer of 1099, they finally reached the Holy Land, where the Christians of Bethlehem hailed them as saviors. But the Muslims and Jews of the surrounding areas were significantly less jazzed to see the invaders.
I think we are about to be the downtrodden.
A Muslim chronicler described widespread panic as the Crusaders marched towards Jerusalem. The city's defenses were no match for the combined forces of the Crusaders. Remember, this wasn't a unified army, but a ragtag crew flying multiple banners. Sometimes, this led to utter chaos. When it came to capturing Jerusalem, though, the more Crusader armies, the merrier. 2 separate Crusader forces surrounded the city, one from the north, the other from the south. At first, the city's inhabitants held out. They had the high ground in the forbidding stone walls. It didn't matter that some were Muslim and some were Jewish, and it didn't matter that the city had changed hands many times before. Civilians stood side by side with the Fatimid army. Jews next to Muslims, Muslims next to Jews. This was big. After all, it was a Fatimid caliph who had ordered the destruction of the non-Muslim holy sites across the region. It was a Fatimid caliph who reintroduced all sorts of humiliating restrictions on the non-Muslims under his rule. Jews were forced to wear wooden blocks around their necks, while Christians bowed under the weight of enormous crosses. Perhaps worst of all were the forced conversions, Christians and Jews becoming Muslim at the point of a sword. Yet, here they were, side by side, a Fatimid garrison next to ordinary civilians, Muslims and Jews arrayed against the enemy. They all knew what would happen if the Crusaders broke through, and the Jewish community of Jerusalem was well aware of what had befallen their brothers and sisters in Europe. But eventually, the Crusaders brought in the big guns, catapults, ladders, all the medieval instruments designed to break a siege. When they breached the walls, they unleashed a bloodbath. The Muslims and Jews who had teamed up to defend their communities weren't trained soldiers. They were ordinary people just trying to stay alive. But there were just too many Crusaders, and they showed too little mercy. As in Europe, Jews were burned alive in their synagogues. But this time, they weren't the only group put to the sword. Their Muslim neighbors suffered similar fates. But as we said, the crusading armies weren't unified. Some forces were more brutal than others, mowing down everyone in their path. Others used human lives as currency, imprisoning or enslaving the locals instead. Sometimes, they'd exchange these prisoners for ransom money. Other times, they'd simply behead or drown them if they got too inconvenient to schlep around. It was not a great time to be Muslim or Jewish in the Holy Land, but their shared suffering led to a kind of solidarity. All over the land, Jews and Muslims opened their homes, sheltering refugees who had fled the Crusaders. Jewish communities across the region raised vast sums of money to ransom prisoners, and both communities were kicked out of Jerusalem. their books and scrolls carted away, their mosques and synagogues turned into churches. But their exile wouldn't last long. Less than 100 years later, a new Muslim sultan would banish the Crusaders and let both Jews and Muslims back into the city. And though they tried again and again, the Crusaders never succeeded in reclaiming Jerusalem. The city remained in Muslim hands until the 20th century. Meanwhile, the story of the interfaith defense of Jerusalem was slowly forgotten. Centuries after the Crusades, Muslims and Jews were fighting each other for control of the city. And that's the story everyone knows. Muslims versus Jews, enemies from the start. But that's not the whole story. When I served in the Israel Defense Forces, I stood shoulder to shoulder with Muslim Israelis who chose to join the army. My commander was Muslim. And though the situation was far from perfect, our shared experience challenged the simple narrative that everyone seems to know. History is complicated, full of hidden moments of astonishing power. The story of Jerusalem has never been simple. The city's holiness can bring out the worst in people. It can inspire a selfish need to dominate and conquer, but it can also inspire people of different faiths to come together in the presence of holiness.